Welcome to this final section for this module of EDN 3200 Ethics in Education. Today we're going to be focusing on ethics, education and technology, both inside and outside the classroom. This is a huge subtopic. We could run a whole course on this alone, but for now we're going to focus on three sub-issues. Big data and the tech giants. Let's be honest, that's a really great band name. But this includes things like surveillance, data scraping and profiling, as well as responses like the Protection of Personal Information Act and what this means for us as ethical educators. We'll also look briefly at the digital divide and inequality and how this might relate to ethics. And caution about what we post online, ethics, care and discretion regarding content we make available, including comments about and/or photos and videos of students. Technology is affecting everything in our over-digitized lives and not just our classrooms. So there is a lot that we can think about here. However, some of the other sections have been over 30 minutes, and so I'm going to make today's a little bit shorter to compensate, and I encourage you to go and read up more about this after this lecture. Let's rock and roll. So, one of the things that we don't talk enough about, especially when it comes to technology and children and schools, not just in South Africa, but the world over, is how big tech companies such as Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, who are also known as GAFA or the Gang of Four, and in more cynical terms, they're also called the Four Horsemen. They conduct extraction, scraping, storing, processing, and sharing of our data for profit, without us knowing, without our permission, and with some serious consequences. The forms of psychological and behavioral manipulation, which are often called nudging, that can be refined and practiced by extracting and amalgamating our everyday data and using this to profile us, are staggering. It's some kind of toxic cocktail of marketing, neuropsychology, and behavioral economics that have enabled algorithms to predict what we will do, often before we are consciously aware of it ourselves. It is really blurring the idea of what constitutes free will. Using machine learning, what we call in artificial intelligence terms neural networks, which are fed vast volumes of data to refine predictions and understandings of how people think and act. Companies like the Big Four are shaping our world and our ways of understanding it in previously unimaginable ways. The scary thing is, these are all private companies which are shielded from scrutiny by democratic oversight. This behemoth is almost entirely unregulated. GAFA have steamrolled over any attempts by individual countries to resist the free flow of data with no checks and balances, overriding World Trade Organization trade legislation and using strong-arm tactics to bend governments to their will. I'm really not exaggerating here. Check out Taking on the Tech Titans at the Transnational Institute for an account of how South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry have had difficulties negotiating data flows and data sovereignty. And at another scale, consider how Mark Zuckerberg has refused to testify before the European Union Court about Facebook's role in various different electoral scandals. I feel like we should stick a sign on each computer at the top, akin to that of the zoo by a dangerous animal, that says, "Do not feed the algorithms." But what does this mean for education? Well, if Cambridge Analytica can manipulate entire elections with the data they got from Facebook, and the United States National Security Agency has, as Edward Snowden has cautioned us, pretty much infiltrated every communications network that involves a smartphone, I think we should be really worried about what this system can do to our children and how we protect them against it until they are old enough and informed enough to make decisions for themselves. If the adults in the room aren't aware, well, how can they empower the kids? So the first thing we need to do is educate ourselves about this stuff. We need to understand that privacy statements and end-user license agreements, all those long-winded pages where you just scroll down and click I agree at the end without reading it. These are effectively a form of legal protection and window dressing for these big companies. It would take you 76 working days a year to read all the privacy statements that you agree to. That's not democracy. That's not consent. That's coercion. Do you know how many ad trackers, click trackers, cookies, and other algorithms record your online behavior and are operating while you surf the net? Are you blocking them? Or at least aware of them? Do you have any sense of how the browser you choose affects your online privacy? For example, I won't touch Google Chrome with a barge pole if I can avoid it. Other browsers, such as Mozilla-based browsers, for example Firefox, they take your privacy a lot more seriously. They give you much more control, and they come with plugins for blocking and counting scripts and cookies that are gobbling up information about you. Are you aware of the court case in South Africa around the RICA legislation that got struck down as unlawful? The government was using it to spy on journalists who were investigating corruption matters. RICA, or the Regulation of Interception of Communications and Provision of Communication-Related Information Act, has huge holes in it that allows for surveillance and monitoring of private citizens' texts, phone calls, email, WhatsApps, and other digital communications without consent or even the knowledge of the people sending and receiving those messages. And in this COVID moment, governments around the world are looking to surveillance through the big data more than ever to implement track and trace programs to contain the pandemic. I recommend you look at the clip from George Thompson in the Vula folder about surveillance and citizen control in China in the wake of COVID. I promise you it will give you the chills. And if you think it's just China, you should see what the UK are currently planning in terms of track and trace apps on their citizens. In 2013, the South African government promulgated the Protection of Personal Information Act, also known as POPI. Do you know about it? Part C of Condition 8 in Chapter 3 of the POPI lays out under what conditions the data of a child or minor may or may not be collected. Given how much we are now doing online learning and classes on Google Classroom, you should probably read this act and think carefully about what data of your students you're storing online and who owns and controls it. In short, big data is a big problem. And we've woken up too late. We're struggling to get a handle on what it means while it shapes everything from the route we take home to the things that we buy online, the adverts we see. To explain the problem to smaller children, I really recommend Murray Hunter's Boris the Baby Bot, which is a children's book about surveillance and big data. But we can't educate our students about things that we don't know ourselves. So think about how your ethical imagination could help you here. Intellectual rigor involves reading up as much as you can about this problem and educating yourself. It also means differentiating between a critical analysis and a conspiracy theory, of which I promise there are plenty. I recommend watching, if you can, James Bridle's video posted in the supplementary material at the end of this lecture. In addition to intellectual rigor, we need public engagement. Read up and support about efforts to hold big tech accountable, and make sure that you are familiar with the legislation efforts that are being put in place in order to do so. And finally, an ethics of care means not only informing your students, but your family and your friends too. Spreading awareness about what big data and big tech are doing to our lives. The second topic I want to briefly touch on today is the digital divide and how this relates to ethics in education. 10% of South Africans have an internet connection to their home, beyond their cell phone. And we've been wrestling a lot with this since UCT undertook to continue lessons via emergency remote teaching. We can't assume all students have access to data, devices, conducive spaces, and reliable electricity. It's why we've made these lectures available in multiple formats, and we've kept it asynchronous so that you don't need to be able to stream video in order to attend your classes. But it is questionable whether continuing to teach online when some might be left behind is ethical at all. Most South Africans only have access to the internet via their phones. Data is ridiculously expensive, and power, well, Eskom. The digital divide is very, very real and widens the already existing gaps between the haves and the have-nots. How do we engage ethically with the irreversible role of technology in our everyday lives in the face of this reality? Just last week, Thursday, on the 4th of June, Tim Berners-Lee, the man credited with inventing the World Wide Web, called for internet connectivity to be declared a basic human right. It has become so critical and indispensable for accessing information that to be without it is to be fundamentally disadvantaged. What do you think? How do we develop a digital sociological imagination? And how do we help our children to do so too? The final question I want to lodge in your minds today is about child safety, professionalism, and online engagement. Given what I've described above as the ubiquity of online footprints and information, what is said and posted online never dies. We tend to engage on our Facebook walls and Twitter feeds as if we're talking to a select group of people. But the truth is, if it's in writing, anyone can copy, paste, and share. And yes, even edit and distort. That even goes for what's on this Vula page. And so we need to be very careful about what we post on our social media pages and write in emails as teachers, whether personal or about work. Because unfortunately, you never know what may come back to bite you. When I worked in the UK, there was an awful website called ratemyteacher.com, which was used to cyberbully teachers mercilessly, posting trolling comments, photoshopped images, and untruths about school staff. Whenever you're online, whether it be on the weekend to your friends or in the Google Classroom comments, make sure you'd be okay with anyone reading what you write or seeing what you post. Anyone. I don't mean to put the fear of death into you, but truly, you cannot be too cautious on this one. If you're uncertain about posting something, then you probably shouldn't. Okay, I promised a shorter presentation today, and so that's a wrap. In summary, we have looked at, briefly, big data, surveillance, and protecting ourselves and students as much as we can. We've also talked a little bit about the digital divide and what this might mean for ethical engagement through technology. And finally, we've briefly commented on safety and caution when sharing and posting information online to avoid cyberbullying and misunderstandings that might cause us a lot of grief and trouble. Over the whole module, we've engaged with theory and practical issues regarding ethics, what being ethical means, how it might relate to our work as teachers, and how it might manifest in our classrooms. We've looked at everyday ethical dilemmas, including those thrown up by the COVID pandemic, how ethics relates to our and our students' bodies, and how technology also creates ethical considerations in new and sometimes perplexing ways. I really hope this module has given you some tools to think with and pause for thought, and a fresh appreciation of the complexity, but also the beauty of being a teacher who's concerned with more than just tests and exam results. I want to leave you with a song to uplift your spirits in times of confusion and uncertainty. It's called Nina Cried Power by Hosier and Mavis Staples. Pop it in your ears when you're feeling like you're confused and you don't know how to do the right thing. Thank you for your attention and time. Let's keep chatting and discussing through the forums as these ideas mature in your heads. Take care of yourselves and others. Bye for now.